Well, folks, here we are. The culmination of 25 years of blood, sweat, and tears from Bethesda Game Studios, according to Todd Howard. They apparently wanted to make a space RPG as far back as the mid-90s, and it just never really happened. They did make a space action game, but they never did make a proper space RPG. And so over the years, they just kept making more Elder Scrolls games, and then they eventually acquired the Fallout IP and started making Fallout games, starting with Fallout 3, of course, then moving on to Fallout 4 and 76, and, well, we all know how those went. But after they finished Fallout 4, they started putting their plans for a space game into motion again. And thus we have Starfield, described by Bethesda Game Studios and Bethesda Softworks, the publisher, as an action role-playing game. This was supposed to be the culmination of 25 years of effort, the culmination of everything Bethesda has been doing up to this point. Everything they've learned, all of the tech they've developed, was supposed to go into making this their biggest, best game yet. At least that was the impression that they gave from all of the pre-release hype-building material, all of the developer behind-the-scenes footage and all that sort of thing. But what they were saying and what they were showing were two very different things. Because what they were saying was that this was a proper space RPG with a heavy emphasis on exploration, and what they were showing looked an awful lot like Fallout 4 in space, down to reusing animations and potentially textures and models and that sort of thing. Some of that is understandable, but when you've got a game that is supposed to be an entirely new franchise and it looks an awful lot like one of your previous games just reskinned, needless to say, people are going to be pretty concerned about that. This impression of it's just Fallout 4 in space did change closer to the game's release, however. They were putting out more information about the game, showing off more footage, and it was clear that they had put some effort into changing things up a fair amount. So, okay, maybe earlier on in the game's development, when they started showing things off to the public for the first time, there was a lot of placeholder assets. I can live with that. But here's the thing. When the game finally got close to its release, we started seeing all of the pre-release coverage, and people were acting like it was the best thing since sliced bread, because that's basically how the gaming press operates. If Bethesda releases a new game, they just shower it in endless praise, unless it's so catastrophically bad, like, say, Fallout 76, that they can't really ignore it, and even then, they'll still downplay how bad the game actually is, and once there's been a few patches down the line, they'll start acting like it's the best thing since sliced bread again. So taking all of that with a grain of salt is not only a must, you really need more than just a grain of salt. It's more like a mountain of salt. And sure enough, when it was finally time for the game to release, we ended up with an interesting situation, because people who pre-ordered the $100 Premium Edition, which hurts to say, but that's beside the point, were able to get a few days of early access to the game before it officially launched to the general public on September 6th. And once the game was in the hands of actual players and not just gaming press, people really started to notice that it really wasn't what Bethesda was making it out to be. So, what exactly did we end up with here? Well, before I really delve into this thing further, I need you to understand a few things so you know what we're dealing with here in terms of this review. I started messing around with this game during its early access period. That does in fact mean that I have the premium edition of the game. However, I did not pay full price for it, thankfully. I managed to get it on discount, so thankfully I managed to pay much, much closer to the standard price, which as far as I'm concerned is still ridiculous at $70 US. But I did that for two reasons. The first of which is I wanted to get this review done as soon as I possibly could, because I knew that if I didn't get it done as soon as possible, then it was going to take a long time. Thus, I went with the premium edition so I could get early access to it so that I could finish it as soon as possible. This does mean I'll eventually get the DLCs at some point as well, because that's included with Premium Edition. I don't know if I'll ever cover those or not. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, after all, I still haven't covered the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim, nor have I covered any of the DLCs for Fallout 4, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens when Starfield's DLC is out, and I've had a chance to take a look at it and see if it is something that I might be interested in covering. Anyway, point is that I have been working on this review since the game launched into early access. And by the time I had finished all of the goals I had set for myself with this one and gotten enough materials to really be comfortable reviewing it, I had been messing with the game for 90.6 hours. That is 90.6 hours. And I want you to keep that number in your mind for later on in the review. That is how long it took me to complete all of the goals that I set for myself going in, including things like, of course, finishing the main storyline, because it's not going to be a review if you don't finish the main storyline, as well as finishing all of the faction quest lines, a whole bunch of side content, outpost building, crafting, ship building, everything necessary to get the full picture on Starfield. What are the results of all of that? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right in and find out. Now, like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, and I want to go ahead and get the elephant in the room out of the way first. This runs on Creation Engine 2, which is the latest iteration of the Creation Engine, which is really just a modified version of the Gamebryo engine. In other words, the Creation Engine is the same exact engine that Bethesda has been using since Morrowind released over 20 years ago now. Now, theoretically, this means that Bethesda should have been updating the engine gradually over time. They should have been going back through the code base and optimizing things, making sure that they're taking advantage of advances in technology. The problem is that Bethesda has not been doing this. They have only been bolting things onto the engine rather ramshackle as the engine has gotten more and more dated, and they haven't gone back through and given it the full workover that it desperately needs at this point. To give you a helpful point of comparison so you understand exactly what I'm talking about from ground-up rework. The original Call of Duty released in 2003, running on a code base derived from the Quake 3 engine. It was modified, of course, but it was still the Quake 3 engine. And then when they went on to Call of Duty 2, Call of Duty 4, they would move on to something they called the IW engine, which was still built on Quake 3, but it had extra features put into it, and at that point it was still fine. As the years went on, they kept adding more and more things to the IW engine until eventually you got to Black Ops 3 and 4, where the engine was basically on its last legs. It was still functional, but they were hitting the limits of what they could really do with it. That's when they did a ground-up rework of the engine. And thus you end up with the massive improvements to the engine with Modern Warfare 2019. That game ran better than its predecessors. It looked far better than its predecessors, and it had far more capabilities than its predecessors, even though that codebase is still ultimately derived from the original Quake 3 engine when you really get down to it. The result was a much-needed refresh for the Call of Duty franchise, and Modern Warfare 2019 was a very successful game in no small part because of that. That is not the treatment that the Creation Engine got going from Creation Engine to Creation Engine 2. Creation Engine 2 is the same engine that powered Fallout 4, but with some fancy lighting effects added onto it a bit ramshackle. There are a few problems with this. The first problem is that because Bethesda hasn't been going through the entire engine code and updating things as has been really necessary over the years to ensure that the game performs well, Starfield runs like hot garbage. Now granted, this shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody who played Fallout 4 or 76 because those games ran like hot garbage as well, but even knowing what to expect after having played Fallout 4 and 76, the terrible performance of Starfield on launch was frankly kind of shocking. Because you have to understand, right now I am running a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64GB of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model. I also have the game installed on a very fast SSD, because I figured that was going to be important. Turns out, it was very important, because if you try to play this thing on a hard drive, it will constantly freeze up as it struggles to load everything in on the fly, so at least I'm avoiding that. But as far as general performance and stability goes, I'm not entirely sure where to begin with that. I have played the game since the early access period was first opened up, so that means I have experience with the game pre-driver updates at all, as well as during the first driver update that was supposedly game ready, and then the second driver update that Nvidia released afterwards, because that first game ready driver was nowhere near enough. And with the initial launch pre-game ready driver, it was running at around 30 to 40 frames per second most of the time. At 1080p, on an RTX 3080. That is absurd for a game that looks like it came out several years ago in terms of the actual tech being presented here. After the first game-ready driver, it was still running in the roughly 30 to 40 range, but then it would actually go up to about 55 or so. After they released the second driver update, it was finally running over 60 frames per second most of the time. There is still a lot of areas where the frame rate will just completely crap out on itself and drop down into the 30s, sometimes even less than that. And yet there are also other areas where the frame rate will go up into the 90s, into the hundreds. It is completely inconsistent and incredibly irritating. And if you run something like Afterburner so you can actually view your hardware usage stats while you're playing, you'll find that the graphics card is getting one hell of a workout. It's pretty much always in the 90s to 100% usage, but your processor is barely doing anything at all. Occasionally, the usage will spike on a single core up to 40, 50%, maybe a bit more than that, and of course some of that depends on how old your processor is and how many cores it has as well. But on my 5900X, I was seeing that the usage was mostly in the 20% or less range on nearly all cores, and occasionally it'll spike up to 40, 50, 60% on a single core for about a second and then go back down. It is just a clear indication that they are not using system resources adequately, and they need to fix this on an engine level. The problem is, they don't seem to be all that keen on doing so. Todd Howard, when asked about how poorly the game was optimized in an interview, said, "Well, we did optimize it. Maybe you should upgrade your computer." This is not an acceptable response when you have the likes of people running 4090s, the actual top of the line right now, and still getting very poor performance. The simple fact of the matter is that if Bethesda even optimized the game at all, they only did so for AMD because they had an exclusivity deal, and thus Nvidia basically had to do their job for them. That is frustrating enough, but it's made even worse by the fact that it wasn't enough. Because the issues in the creation engine are so deeply rooted that there is just no amount of graphics card driver updates that are going to fix some of these serious fundamental problems. Now, if this were only in the realm of things like performance, optimization, in terms of visual quality, audio quality, things like that, then that would be one thing. But the problems within the creation engine go much deeper than that. It's down to the way the game itself has to be built based on the limitations of the engine. Now, I'll talk about that more when I get to the gameplay, but as far as how it affects the presentation, performance, visuals, sound, things like that, you end up having to put up with generally wildly inconsistent and often quite poor performance. You have to put up with really weird glitches all over the place, issues that have been in the engine for years that still haven't been fixed. For example, the stuttering problem whenever you switch between items in your favorites menu. So let's say you have a shotgun in one slot, a rifle in another, and, I don't know, a sword in another slot, and you want to switch between those three weapons. Every single time you do that, the game stutters, quite significantly. And the further you are in the game, the worse the effect gets. You may wonder why this occurs. Well, as it turns out, whenever you switch to a weapon that has at least one trait on it, these are the things that make them into rare or legendary weapons or whatever, it rereads your entire inventory, not just the weapon that you're switching to. Here's the real fun part about that. It does this for every single trait that you have on that particular weapon. So if the weapon has 3 traits, it's 3 inventory reads, all at once. Which means that the further you are in the game, and the more legendary weapons and such that you have, the worse the effect is going to be. Because they decided to just brute force the entire thing as opposed to putting in an actually efficient method of switching between your various weapons. This has been a problem in the engine since at least Fallout 4, and from what I've seen, apparently some people were having trouble with it in Skyrim as well. Now, the main reason I'm saying it's been a problem since at least Fallout 4 and not saying since at least Skyrim is because I personally haven't run into the issue in Skyrim, because when I played Skyrim, I was always using the menus to switch between the various weapons and such, so it never really occurred anyway. When I was switching between the weapons, I was on the menus and it wouldn't have been a noticeable stutter to begin with. And if for whatever reason I decide to cover Skyrim again, I'll go back and test this out to see if I do actually encounter this problem in Skyrim as well. But for now, let's just say it's been a problem since at the very least Fallout 4 that I can personally confirm. And while I know that it might sound a bit silly to fixate on this, I need you to understand that this is only one problem. One out of many problems in the creation engine. It has been in the engine for nearly a decade at this point, and despite knowing that it is a problem, Bethesda seems to either be incapable or simply refuses to fix it. So while this one particular problem is certainly annoying but not game-breaking, it's not necessarily that this one issue is something that I'm fixating on entirely. I am pointing this out because this is indicative of Bethesda's modus operandi with regards to the creation engine. They have been taking the approach of, well, what we've got works perfectly fine, let's just add stuff onto it, and if it happens to break something, then maybe we can fix that. Just a quick note here on this particular issue. Just after I finished recording the audio for the presentation bit here, they did actually put out a patch that fixed a different issue that was kind of related with the hand scanner freezing up constantly, and while it didn't completely get rid of the weapon stuttering effect, it did significantly reduce it. The thing is, they didn't even mention weapon stuttering in the patch notes, so I have a feeling they either just didn't care about that particular issue, or didn't even notice that it was at least improved somewhat with this patch. Either way, my point about their modus operandi with development and this constant overlooking of problems is still relevant, and if anything, this update points out the fact that they don't even seem to know what they're doing with their own engine anymore. The approach they should have been taking is, okay, we need to go through our entire engine on a very regular basis and make sure that we are updating core components of it so that it remains efficient, performative, and capable of doing what we are setting out to do. And because they have not been taking the appropriate approach with this, they're at the point where not only are these various issues still plaguing the engine itself is not capable of doing what they really want it to do. It is no longer an engine that stands up with the best of them. It is actively holding Bethesda back at this point, and they desperately need to either replace it entirely, or if they're going to stick with the engine, which we know they're going to, they need to go through the entire code base with a fine-tooth comb, and not only fix the problems that they should have fixed years ago, but simply go through the entire thing and make sure that they are updating the entire code base to be as efficient and performative as possible, so that when they do try to introduce new graphical features, new physics features, and so on and so forth, they can do so without it causing severe performance problems, without it causing severe glitches, and so that people can actually look at this new feature and say, hey, that's actually really cool, good on you for adding that, Bethesda, as opposed to, oh look, it's another Bethesda game that barely functions. And now that I've talked your ear off about the performance, what are we dealing with in terms of actual presentation here? Well, it does certainly look better than Fallout 4 and 76. Admittedly, that's not a gargantuan task, but that's beside the point. That doesn't mean that the game is drop-dead gorgeous or anything like that, though. There are certainly some areas in the game where they did put in quite a bit of artistry to them, and it has some nice set pieces here and there, but you are dealing with graphics that look like they could have really come out a few years ago at this point. It does have solid texture quality and good modeling. The animations are generally pretty decent, although some of them are still basically ripped from Fallout 4 and 76, if you're really paying attention. And the weapon handling animations in particular are considerably smoother than they were in Fallout 4 and 76. Although the way the weapons themselves actually function is often extremely questionable at absolute best. And it is a bit annoying that they still haven't put in partial versus full reloads, because they tried to do something like that with the double-barreled shotgun, the Coachman. Whenever you reload after firing a single shell out of that, you notice that there is one shell missing when you go to reload. So they probably could implement partial versus full reloads, but they just choose not to. Probably because that would require them to put in a modicum of effort. Anyway, the real standout feature as far as the visuals are concerned is the rather massive upgrade to the way the characters' faces look. They actually look like they could be people now, as opposed to weird homunculi like they were in previous Bethesda games. Good job, Bethesda, you've finally fixed one of the things people meme about the most. Granted, that doesn't stop some of the faces from looking kinda weird, and the characters' dead stares as you walk past them in the middle of the street because of the way they're scripted, and it doesn't stop the animations on the characters from breaking sometimes, but the faces themselves actually look pretty decent now, so there is that. They did also try to introduce some new lighting tech into the engine, and it's fine when it works, although most of the time you're probably not going to notice it all that much, and you are going to notice when it starts to glitch out on you, which is fairly common. And once you get past the actual technical aspects of the visuals, you end up with the aesthetics themselves, which are kind of a grab bag of various elements of sci-fi. Some of it is clearly inspired by classic retro sci-fi movies and TV shows and such. Some of it is inspired by more modern fare like Starship Troopers in particular, and some of it, like say the Varun faction's aesthetic, falls more into the purview of stuff like the Romulans in Star Trek. There's not really a whole lot of subtlety in these inspirations either. I mean, when you're wandering around Freestar Collective space, they're basically space truckers and space cowboys, and they look like that. And then you wander around United Colonies space, and their entire faction is basically Diet Starship Troopers. The thing is that these aesthetics are all well and good when you're starting the game out, because they're a bit of variety, but the more you delve into the game, the more samey everything starts to appear. When you go to somewhere in Freestar space, it's going to be fairly rustic. You go to somewhere in United Colonies space, it's going to be fairly sterile or industrial. You board a space station or a spaceship, and they're all going to look fairly similar to each other on the interiors. And then when you go to land on planets, you find that most of them are just barren rocks, so they're rather boring to look at, and the ones that aren't usually just have a fair amount of vegetation but are otherwise fairly unremarkable. And while a small number of the planets do have more handcrafted content on them and look a bit more unique than others, even then, most of those planets still look pretty much the same as a lot of the generic planets that you'll just be wandering around between. So those visuals, while certainly solid in and of themselves, and occasionally actually quite good looking, do very quickly wear thin and become very repetitive. Then you move over into sound design and things tend to go all over the place there. On the one hand, every character in the game is voiced. This is fine. The problem is that those voices generally become quite repetitive as well because they can only have so many actors between all of the various characters. Some of the unique characters do have unique voices, of course. For example, all of the main companions that will be accompanying you throughout the main storyline all have unique voices. Major NPCs that you'll encounter will also have unique voices, but when you're just wandering around and talking to merchants or guards or the various crew at outposts or whatever, they all tend to sound very similar to each other, and in fact usually just have the same lines that they repeat over and over again between all of these characters. So you're just going to hear the same lines repeated over and over again, regardless of which planet you're on, regardless of who you're talking to. This is par for the course for a Bethesda game, of course, because there's only so much they can do with that, but it is still fairly repetitive. As for the quality of all these voices, well, the voice actors have all done a pretty admirable job with what they're given. The thing is that what they were given is from Bethesda, and the quality of Bethesda's writing has been on a pretty significant downslide for the past almost 20 years now. So the quality of conversations can vary wildly from actually pretty decent all the way down to headache-inducingly awful. Although, to be fair, most of it is somewhere in the middle, usually on the very mediocre side. So overall, the voice acting is very much a mixed bag. On the one hand, quite a few of the guns just don't sound anywhere near as beefy as they really should. Stuff that is chambered for 43 Ultra Mag, for example, you would think would be a Magnum caliber gun. That would mean it would be fairly powerful, and yet they generally don't sound like that. Or you can end up with something like the 27 caliber Rattler pistol, which sounds like a complete pea shooter, but the Side Star, which uses the same exact ammunition, actually sounds fairly beefy, even though it does about the same damage.
I'm shooting at ghosts now.
It's the kind of thing that just leaves you scratching your head wondering what they were thinking in that regard. And in fact, the energy weapons generally sound beefier than the ballistic weapons, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And as for the explosion sounds, I mean, they're not terrible, but they're just not particularly great either. They don't have a whole lot of bass kick to them, and whether you're in the vacuums of space or running around on the ground blasting enemies, it doesn't really seem to matter much. None of the weapons or explosions just sound all that beefy or powerful, and that just contributes to making the combat less satisfying. As for the rest of the sound effects, I mean, they get the job done just fine. Nothing particularly amazing, nothing particularly bad, although there is an awful lot of sound in space, which is weird because space is a vacuum and it should be deadly quiet. Now, I get why they did this. Having the vacuum of space actually sound like it should, which is basically nothing at all except what you can hear in your own suit, would ultimately make all of the environments where you are in a vacuum kind of boring to navigate. But it does mean that the game is leaning much more into the fi part of sci-fi than the actual sci part of it. Anyway, the final element of the presentation to speak about here is the soundtrack, which was composed by Enon Zur. As is typical with Enon Zur, the quality of the compositions is great. You've got a lot of very well-made orchestral music and even some electronic stuff mixed in here and there, depending on whether you're in combat or in a place like Neon, where you're going to end up with more of a cyberpunk aesthetic. But despite the quality of these compositions being quite high, unfortunately they're just not very memorable. The only tune that you're likely to remember in the entirety of Starfield is the main Starfield theme that plays all the time as a leitmotif. And even that is still really not all that memorable. It actually sounds more like a generic movie soundtrack than anything else. Again, this isn't to say that the soundtrack itself is bad, it just doesn't really stand out from the pack and just isn't all that memorable. Which certainly isn't a deal breaker or anything, but it is a bit disappointing. And so when you bring all of the presentation together, not talking about the performance issues or the engine limitations, and just talking about the actual quality of what they are presenting to the player, they've generally done a pretty decent job with it. It's just certain elements really let the presentation down as a whole, and it ends up being a very mixed bag overall. But here's the thing, as important as the presentation and particularly the performance are, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. If those are good enough, then they can compensate for any other issues the game has. So what exactly are we dealing with there? Well, the story is that you play as a new contractor with the Argos Extraction's mining outfit, and as you show up for the first day on the job, only to end up coming across a strange artifact buried in the rock, and once you manage to get it out of the rock, it gives you strange visions and then knocks you out. Soon after this, Barrett, a member of Constellation, a space exploration group, arrives to pick up the artifact, and pirates attack the base. After you resolve that, Barrett elects to stay behind at the mining facility and help them clean up the mess, considering that the pirates were basically following him and ended up attacking the mining facility because he arrived there. And you are sent to the Lodge, Constellation's headquarters, in order to present everybody who's there the artifact and let them know what you experienced, eventually, of course, joining Constellation, pretty much whether you want to or not. And the phrase, whether you want to or not, is going to become a theme here, so just bear with me a moment while I continue through the rest of this explanation, but you'll understand by the end of the video. After you have presented the artifact and ultimately joined Constellation, they send you off into space to find other artifacts and bring them back so they can study them and figure out what they're for. Eventually, this results in discovering that the artifacts point to strange structures on various planets in space that give anomalous readings on your scanners, and once you arrive to the first one to find out what's there, the game reveals to you in the form of the fast travel point unlocking and the location discovered message saying that it is a temple. And then you go inside and find out that it's a zero-G environment and that you need to float into a series of sparkling lights in order to stabilize a series of rings in the middle of the room, at which point you float into the rings and then it gives you a power, which is effectively space magic. But more on that later. For a while, this trend continues. You hunt down more artifacts, you hunt down more temples, you gain more powers, and eventually, you finally encounter the main antagonist faction of the game, the Starborn. Seemingly a hyper-advanced civilization that tells you you're meddling in powers far beyond your comprehension and that you need to turn over the artifacts to them or suffer the consequences. Obviously, Constellation extends the middle finger to them, and the rest of the story basically plays out as you continue to track down the artifacts and fight the Starborn along the way, until eventually all is revealed. And it's at this point I'm going to put up the spoiler warning. Because in order for you to understand what's really wrong with this storyline, I have to spoil it for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the spoiler warning up on the screen right now with a time code that you can skip to in order to get the conclusion to what's going on with the story without actually having the details spoiled for you. But fair warning there as well, I really feel like the context is actually truly necessary to understand the sheer levels of crapitude we're dealing with here. Now then, with the spoiler warning out of the way, let's get on with it. You find out that the purpose of the artifacts is that when they are brought together in a structure called the Armillary, they will point the way to something called the Unity. The Unity is the gateway to the multiverse, and by venturing into it, you will become Starborn yourself and venture off into another universe. This, of course, brings up the question of, well, if by venturing into the Unity you become Starborn, why would the other Starborn want to prevent you from doing this? Well, there are basically two camps on that. The first camp believes that because the artifacts are so powerful beyond human comprehension, really, they represent a grave danger, which is revealed to you when you go to the NASA facility on Earth and find out that the actual reason that Earth's magnetosphere was completely destroyed and thus people had to evacuate Earth entirely is because NASA was performing experiments on one of the artifacts, and the resulting prototype grav drive ended up really wrecking the Earth's magnetosphere. Thus, this side of the Starborn believes that only worthy individuals should really be able to track down all of the artifacts and become Starborn, because if they don't, then the results could be catastrophic. Okay, makes sense. Humanity's meddling with technology they don't really understand, and that can be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. Understandable. What about the other camp? Well, they're just concerned about themselves, because the more you travel throughout the multiverse, the more power you gain, so clearly you want to get all of the artifacts for yourself and become more powerful. But regardless of their motivation, they're in your way, so you need to deal with them somehow. You can either side with one faction or the other, or you can side with neither of them and either persuade them to back down or just end up fighting them. And then once you've done all that and collected all the artifacts, it's off to the Unity, at which point the game presents to you the final choice. Either you can venture off into the multiverse and become Starborn, or you can just go back to the universe you were already in and keep exploring it. In other words, you can either continue exploring your own universe, or you can go into New Game Plus. The thing about that is that by making it so you either venture off into New Game Plus or just keep exploring, the game doesn't really have an ending. Even if you choose not to go into New Game Plus, the option is always there. All you have to do is rebuild the Armillary on your ship. Once you do that, you spin up your grav drive, and then you can just venture off into the multiverse as the game intends you to do. The reason that Starfield's story is so bad is not just because the Starborn themselves are frankly, a completely uninteresting antagonist faction whose capabilities are hilariously over-exaggerated when you can just walk right up to them and mow them down before they even get a chance to shoot back at you most of the time. And even if you get in ship combat with them, their ships really aren't as powerful as they're made out to be either. They go down fairly easily. But aside from that, aside from the Starborn themselves being a really weak antagonist faction, once you know what the storyline's actually for, it's impossible to engage with it. It is literally there to push you into New Game Plus. That's the only reason the story in Starfield exists. It is to push you into New Game Plus. And once you're in New Game Plus, you have the option of skipping the story entirely, and if you do that, then the only thing that is left is the mechanical purpose of finding the artifacts so that you can build the armillary and then venture off into New Game Plus again. So rather than actually make an ending for the game, they decided that it would just be easier to have the player continue to repeat things over and over and over again until eventually they just get tired of playing and stop. To make matters worse, they really phoned it in with the actual mission designs for the main story as well. Nearly all of them just have you go to some random rock in the middle of space, fight your way through a generic facility, find an artifact buried in the rock in an area that is just tucked off in the back of the facility somewhere, grab the artifact, and then go back to the lodge and put that artifact with the others, or once you get to the point where you have to build the armillary somewhere else, you go to wherever that is and you put the artifact with the others there. And if you want to go find a temple somewhere to get a new power, you have to go to the Eye, Constellation's star station, and then talk to Vladimir, who will send you off to some other planet where you need to follow scanner anomalies, which is just the scanner freaking out a bit, until eventually you get to the temple and you complete the same exact routine at every single temple, which is you start floating in 0G and then you have to float through some sparkles until eventually the rings stabilize and then you can get your new power. And then you spawn outside of the temple, and once you've encountered the Starborn, they start attacking you once you get your new power and spawn outside the temple. Regardless of whether you're tracking down temples or tracking down artifacts, you're going to generic locations doing generic things. It's like you're playing through side quests, but they're actually main story quests. And then you get to the very, very small number of quests that do actually have you go to unique areas. And of those, the only one that is actually memorable is the one that is a cheap Titanfall 2 knockoff. You see, in Titanfall 2, there's one level that gives you a device that allows you to go between two timelines of the same area instantly. It is a seamless, instant transmission. You go back and forth between the levels, and of course, since it's Titanfall 2, you have that glorious fast movement and the really fun gunplay. Starfield's version has you going back and forth between two different universes of the same facility, and you can only do it at specific distortion points, which means that if you have to go back and forth to do certain things, it can get really tedious really quickly. And it doesn't have Titanfall 2's awesome movement and awesome gunplay. It has Starfield's movement and gunplay. So while the mission itself is actually relatively memorable, when it's one of only 2 missions in the entire main storyline that's actually memorable, and the other one's only memorable because it's really annoying, you have a pretty serious problem. And in case you're wondering about that quest that's really annoying, let me put it this way. It picks your 2 highest affinity companions and then gives you a choice of which one gets to die. I assume Bethesda meant this as some sort of emotional moment, where you would be really attached to these companions, and thus when the choice comes up of which one to save, it would be a real nail-biter of a decision. Except, what happens if you've only stuck with one companion by the time you get to that point? It just chooses whoever has the next highest affinity, which could be anybody that you haven't been adventuring with, and so you just don't care. Of course, that's assuming you care to begin with for reasons that I'll explain in a moment when I start talking more about the characters themselves. But regardless of whether you care about the companion or not, it's largely irrelevant because first, that's a really cheap and lazy way of trying to get a reaction out of the player, and second, and much more importantly, the entire purpose of the main story is just to push you into New Game Plus. That is the only reason that it exists. And because it does that, It basically invalidates every single choice that you have throughout the entire game, including which one gets to live or die. This is ultimately why the story in Starfield is so terrible. It's not just the fact that the writing itself is bad in general. It's not just the fact that the main story missions are mostly composed of going through generic facilities that you will encounter on many, many planets, more on that in a moment, and just going through the same facilities but with an extra bit tacked on at the end where you find the artifact. It's not just the fact that the Starborn themselves are really uninteresting antagonists, or the fact that you become Starborn yourself, whether you really want to or not. It's the fact that Bethesda's main storyline is built in a way that completely undermines the entire point of it being a supposed role-playing game. You're supposed to make decisions as your character and experience the consequences of those choices, whether good or bad. That is the essence of role-playing games. It's not stats and combat and loot and quests. It's choice and consequence. And for that to work, there needs to be some sort of finality to the consequences. It needs to be, okay, you did this thing, this results in these consequences. You have to live with the consequences of your actions now. This was your choice as this character. You might start a new game as a different character and make a different choice, but that's for a different character to decide. This character did this thing, it resulted in this consequence. When your storyline says, by the way, reset button, you completely undermine that. Not only that, but they have completely undermined the entire idea of player agency by saying, okay, there's not actually a real ending in Starfield, because no matter whether you decide to jump into New Game Plus immediately at the end or just go back and continue to explore your own universe, the option's always there. And the dialogue from your companions about the whole matter is basically, look, we all know that it might not be immediately, but you're eventually gonna go off into the multiverse, and thus you're gonna go into New Game Plus. And when you know that the reset button for the consequences of your actions is only a ship part away, why would you give a single solitary crap about any of the consequences of any of your actions? And that's assuming there are any consequences of those actions at all. I mean, Bethesda's design philosophy at this point is basically to make sure that the player has absolutely no chance of failure whatsoever, that they can never get into a position where they can't continue a quest line. And nowhere was this more personified in the fact that there is one particular mission in the Ryujin Industries quest line where you have to infiltrate the company tower in order to get data off of a computer, and the chief of security tells you, look, you are going to have to avoid the guards as much as you possibly can, and I'll give you a stun weapon in case you do encounter them. Well, I decided to try to take the stealth route with this, and that was constantly failing for reasons that I'll explain when I get more to the gameplay section. So I decided, you know what, screw it, let's use the stun weapon. Turns out the stun weapon was terrible, so I said, screw it, let's just mow down every single enemy in my path and we'll see what happens. At the end of the whole mess, the only thing that happened was that the security chief complained about it. The security chief just had a large portion of his security force massacred in his own office building, and the only thing he really has to say here is, what the hell were you thinking? Why did you do that? Okay, screw it, give me the data anyway, we'll just keep going here. And absolutely nothing comes of that. You don't get kicked out of the company, you don't go to prison for being a mass-murdering psychopath, you don't have to pay any fines, you don't get docked pay. It is just shrugged off because Bethesda utterly refuses to let the player fail, to let the player actually experience consequences of their own actions. The only time you're allowed to have consequences for your actions is through very specific choices in quest lines, and thus those have very specific outcomes that are ultimately kind of pointless in the long run when you really think about it. And again, even what few consequences they have are completely undermined because the reset button is just an arm area away. The end result of all of this is that despite Bethesda's attempt to put more choices in the various quest lines and to give the player more options at the start during character creation to kind of define their character, they have simultaneously made this more of a role-playing game than their past several efforts, and less of one than their past several games. Because, hey, at least in those other games, if you want to hit the reset button on your choices, you have to start a new game entirely. In Starfield, on the other hand, you can experience every outcome of every questline on a single character because it's just built in, which means that you really aren't playing a character at all. You're actually just player one. The character that you create at the beginning is just an avatar, and nothing more. This makes caring about the writing and, frankly, the setting in general a lot more difficult, but we're gonna go ahead and try anyway and just take a look and see what there is on offer there. So the main story is absolutely terrible. What about the characters? Are they interesting? Not really. I mean, Andreja has a few secrets, but you can guess what those are pretty quickly. And all the other companions are rather straightforward characters that just don't have a whole lot going on. They're not necessarily bad characters per se, but they just don't really have the right vibe for main companions. It's not just about a character having an interesting personality or past, it's about what they represent to the game as a whole. Think about it this way, when you think of Mass Effect, you instantly can remember any of the companions in that series, regardless of who they are, because they each represent something significant with regards to the story or the setting. For example, Garrus is basically your emissary to the entire culture of the Turians. Same thing goes for Rex and the Krogan, Tali'Zorah and the Quarians, Liara and the Asari, so on and so forth. But even the, air quotes, boring human characters like Ashley and Kaidan have their own roles to play in the story, and they have their own roles in the crew. Not only do they have their combat roles, but they also have the role of being kind of a grounding influence. Look, this is kind of the standard human outlook on things, or a slightly more hardline human look on things, and so you get an idea of what you're dealing with. The companions in Starfield don't really serve that kind of role. I mean, you would think, for example, that Sam Coe, a direct descendant of the founder of the Freestar Collective, would kind of be your emissary to the Freestar Collective. Except he isn't. He's just a single dad who wants to explore space. You would think that Sarah, having formerly been a part of the UC military, would be your emissary into the United Colonies, and she doesn't do that. She's just primarily a scientist with a bit of a checkered past, and that's really all she's got going on. To put it simply, you could complete the entirety of Starfield without the companions at all, and it really wouldn't make much of a difference. I mean, sure, they'll comment on some of your choices, they might not necessarily like some of the things you do, you'll get the so-and-so liked that, so-and-so disliked that notification whenever that kind of thing happens. And funnily enough, they can be wildly inconsistent on what they like versus don't like. I mean, sometimes they will condemn you for doing one thing and then pivot and praise you for doing the exact same thing in a different circumstance. I mean, to give you a prime example of that, Sarah tells you that she doesn't mind if you break the law in service of your goals, and so she'll turn a blind eye as long as you don't do anything particularly egregious like just murder people. But then you go and you start taking a few things here and there. Let's say you find a digipick and you really need one, so you grab it. But instead of turning a blind eye to that kind of thing like she said she would, she'll complain about that kind of thing whenever you do it. That kind of thing can get incredibly annoying, and the fact that it constantly goes all over the place, where one moment they'll be fine with you doing something and then the next moment they won't be fine with it and they'll complain about it endlessly, makes the simple experience of trying to play through Starfield with the companions in tow a lot more annoying of an experience than it really should be. And in addition, it's not exactly easy to figure out exactly where you stand with them on a relationship level, because the affinity system is managed in the background, so you're never really sure exactly how much affinity you have with a companion, and so you might be doing something completely inconsequential, and then all of a sudden, because you've triggered an event that gives a player affinity with the companion they're with, so out of nowhere you'll get the next stage of their companion quest, which might make them impossible to separate from until that stage of the companion quest is done. Or you might reach a conversation trigger, at which point the next time you talk to them, they'll discuss some recent event or something they've observed with you. But they never really say or do anything that's actually all that interesting, and thus you end up caring about them more for the extra inventory space than anything else. And while some of the companions are romanceable, they're not really interesting enough to really want to do that, and even if you did want to do that, there is the odd quirk of all of them being what I would term as player sexual, which is a problem I've been noticing coming up a bit more frequently lately, where it seems like developers are almost afraid to give romanceable characters a defined sexuality because that might make some of their fans a bit unhappy, so they just say screw it and make all of them bisexual. I mean, I know the game is set about 300 years in the future, but I guarantee you if humanity even survives 300 years in the future, you are not going to have a situation where everyone is bisexual. It just doesn't work that way. All this really does is come across as non-committal. Either the developers were lazy and just didn't want to bother putting in the modicum of effort it would have taken to actually make the characters have defined sexualities, or they're just afraid of offending someone, so they say, screw it, we're just going to make them romanceable regardless. I'm not exactly sure what specifically happened with that in Starfield's case, but regardless, being lazy and non-committal in your writing of characters results in the characters just being less interesting. And that's really unfortunate because the voice actors do a very good job with what they're given. It's just that what they're given is frankly just bland and uninteresting for the most part. I mean, Barrett is supposed to be the funny guy, and he's not funny. And even once you expand your criteria into not just the companions, but all of the NPCs in the game, you find that the vast majority of them just aren't interesting at all, which is kind of what you would expect for most of the NPCs in the game. But even the ones that are supposed to be interesting, like some of the main story characters, just don't really have a whole lot going on. I mean, to give you a prime example of the kinds of things they'll do to try to set a character apart, but ultimately fail at doing so in the long run, Vlad is a former pirate. He is retired, and he is the only person in the entire game to use the pirate speak that he throws around, where he has odd idiomatic ways of saying certain things that harken back to the goofy sayings you would expect a pirate to say in, say, a pirate TV show or movie. It's just a bit of an odd quirk, and it makes you think that when you go on the Crimson Fleet quest line and you're dealing with, you know, the actual space pirates that are still active, that you might encounter that kind of thing again. Nope. He is literally the only person in the entire game who talks like that. You will never find any writings, you will never find any recordings, whether it be of historical space pirates or not. You will never find any NPC that talks like Vlad does. He only does it because it's an odd personality quirk and they had to do something to try to give him some sense of uniqueness. Well, sure, it works to some degree, but it just comes across as really contrived and kinda stupid. And speaking of kinda stupid, there's a fair amount of dialogue in the game that goes beyond simply being boring and uninteresting and becomes outright cringe-inducingly awful. And unfortunately, a lot of those lines are in the player's dialogue options more so than the actual NPCs. But you find yourself going from attempts at emulating the snappy dialogue from Marvel movies over the past decade or so, which really played itself out, by the way. They really should not be emulating that. Or putting in dialogue that either intentionally or unintentionally drags modern-day social and political issues into the game. And you know what? If this game were like, say, Disco Elysium, where they inherently made it to be a politically minded game, and thus they try to play to that, then I probably wouldn't have that much of an issue with it. But this is a Bethesda game, and we've already established that the writers are pretty non-committal, so if they're going to introduce this kind of stuff into the game, it's gonna be in a cringy, eye-roll-inducing manner that outright gets annoying after a while. Thankfully, most of the dialogue is just bland and uninteresting and has absolutely nothing to do with socio-political bullshit. But when it does come up, you can't help but facepalm and go, oh, for fuck's sake. It's one of those situations where you can't necessarily be entirely sure what the writer's motivation was, but you get the really strong feeling that they were trying to win some brownie points with a certain demographic that wasn't in the slightest danger of giving a crap about the game anyway. And when the vast majority of the game frankly doesn't give a single solitary crap about modern day politics, you end up with some of the dialogue just feeling wildly out of place and actually taking you out of the experience a fair bit. Is it enough to completely ruin Starfield in and of itself? Of course not. We're talking about a few lines here and there in a very large game. But you have to keep in mind, it's not about one particular thing necessarily ruining the entire experience. It's about everything adding up to the whole. So the main story is terrible. The characters are, at the very best, pretty bland and uninteresting, and at worst, kinda cringe-inducing, and the dialogue ranges from acceptably mediocre to downright terrible. So what else is going on in the writing department? Well, when you start delving into the faction quest lines, you find very quickly that there's not a whole lot going on any of them, and what is there is overly condensed and often highly rushed. As a prime example of this, when you go on the Freestar Collective questline, it's your journey to become a Freestar Ranger, theoretically one of the shining examples of law and order throughout the Collective. And your journey to become a Ranger starts when you land in a keyless city and you have to help the Marshal out with a bank robbery in progress, and once you've dealt with that, regardless of how ham-fisted your methods were, regardless of how much you actually botched the situation up, he seems to think that you're Ranger material, so you go to the Rangers headquarters at the Rock, you end up getting sworn in as a deputy, and then you accompany a full Ranger out to investigate some strange happenings at a farm on some small planet somewhere. And then you find out that there's people that have been intimidating farmers, so then you start trying to track down exactly who these people are, why they're intimidating farmers, and ultimately who's responsible for the whole thing. At no point during this entire investigation do you actually employ any investigative skills whatsoever. You just wander from place to place, you talk to a few people here and there, you get in a few fights with the mercs responsible for intimidating farmers, you collect a few evidence slates, and you bring those back to the Ranger's computer guy so that he can decrypt them, and you can find out where the main base of this mercenary group is, so you can go in there and mow down every single one of them there and confront their leader, who also gets mowed down, but he reveals who was responsible for the whole thing. Once you find out who's responsible, you go confront them, and then however that situation resolves, you go back to the Marshal, he swears you in as a full Ranger, and then you're done. There are no more cases. There is no build-up to this case. It's just the one case, and there are absolutely no follow-up cases. The game gives you your Ranger badge, it gives you a new outfit, and it gives you a free ship, one of the better ones in the game, and that's it. And from then on out, the Freestar Rangers may as well not even exist, because the only thing you get from them from then on out are generic missions that you can accept at the mission board, which regenerate after a while. Now, I thought there might actually be more to it than that, because once I got sworn in as a Ranger, one of the other Rangers pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I got a new job for you. There's this criminal that we really need to track down that's off in the far edges of space, and I think you're the one to be able to do it." So I thought to myself, okay, cool, when I'm able to get over to that area, because it was fairly far out and my ship wasn't capable of jumping that far yet, I'll go ahead and take a look and maybe it'll be another quest line. It was not. It was just another bounty hunt in a generic mining facility, exactly the same as the dozen or so other mining facilities that I had gone on bounty hunts in before that. You might be thinking to yourself, okay DW, I see your point there, but that's just one of the factions. I know you're saying this to me because that's what I thought after I finished the Freestar Collective questline. It was the first faction quest I finished. So then I went and started the other faction questlines that I had access to up to that point, which were the UC Vanguard and Ryujin Industries. The Vanguard questline has you signing up at the recruitment office and then being assigned to go to a small colony to help them out with some sensor or communications problem that they've got, only to find out that the entire facility has been utterly massacred by a terrormorph, which is this big nasty creature that is supposed to be ridiculously difficult to kill and is extremely dangerous to the point where it has caused humans to abandon entire settlements just to survive. Now, of course, this questline made this out to be some massive reveal. What's a terrormorph? Oh no, these are horrible. Only I had encountered one about an hour or so before the UC Vanguard questline on a random planet in the middle of nowhere, and apart from being a complete bullet sponge, it went down like it was nothing. But of course, because Bethesda's writing couldn't possibly conceive of encountering a terrormorph even the slightest bit before this moment, it acted like this was my character's first time ever seeing one, and thus Thorax Starfieldson was staring at this thing going, "What's a terrormorph?" As if he hadn't already blasted one into the next century and seen what they look like at the museum that you go through at the beginning of the UC Vanguard questline. Anyway, as soon as the terrormorph shows up, you know instantly that that's going to be all that the rest of the UC Vanguard questline is about, and indeed, that is exactly what the questline is about. Tracking down the terrormorphs, figuring out exactly where they come from, and dealing with the situation once and for all. By the end of this whole questline, you become what is known as a Class 1 citizen, and that allows you to have a free penthouse in New Atlantis, the main city of the UC, the United Colonies, and that's pretty much it, actually. They do try to throw in a twist here or there, but it never really works. To give you a prime example of that, I do have to spoil the UC Vanguard questline for you, so spoiler alert here, you can skip ahead to wherever is shown on the screen right now to skip this spoiler. But at a certain point during the questline, the main NPC you've been talking to says, "Oh, by the way, I'm a clone of this general known as Victus. As part of the peace agreement from the Colony War a few years ago, he was executed as a war criminal, so I just thought you should know this because it really sours people's disposition towards me." The problem with this is that you know from the millisecond that this NPC says that they're a clone of Victus, that Victus is still alive, and that he's going to come up during this questline. Because Bethesda is utterly terrified that the player is going to miss something, so they just spell everything out to you right then and there. They don't say, "Oh, maybe we could handle this more subtly," and hint at the fact that this character is a clone of Victus, rather than just outright telling the player. Because if it were something that were, say, hidden in the background and that you had to go out of your way to find, or maybe something that you actually had to go out of your way to ask the character about, then it might actually come as a surprise when you find out that Victus is alive. But because they have set it up in such a way to where you cannot avoid this conversation, and this character just outright tells you that she is a clone of Victus, and not really a clone, more like a genetically altered offspring is really the better way of describing it. It's more gene editing and such than actual cloning, but that's beside the point. The point is that because the character goes out of their way to tell you this, you know that it is relevant to the questline in some way, and the only way it would be relevant is if Victus is still alive. So as soon as you are told, "By the way, I'm a clone of Victus," you instantly know, okay, well, I'm going to run into Victus, and they're going to act like it's going to be some massive reveal, this conspiracy that, if exposed, could shake the very fabric of the UC and the fragile peace between the UC and the Freestar Collective. But the thing is, because it's a Bethesda game, and they don't want you to miss anything, you know as well that no matter what the outcome of the UC Vanguard questline is, it doesn't matter. You can go about everything else just fine and barely even notice a difference, if any at all. So funnily enough, because Bethesda is not only incapable of but utterly refuses to put any kind of actual subtlety in their writing, they end up spoiling the surprises to their own questlines almost immediately, leaving the player face-palming and eye-rolling whenever these supposed surprises come up, and the only options the player has to respond with all assume that the player was actually surprised by these things, like they couldn't see what was coming from a mile away. And this has been a problem that Bethesda's writing teams had for quite a long time. They basically assume the player is a moron, that you're just utterly incapable of figuring anything out on your own, so you have to have everything force-fed to you. What they don't seem to understand is that when you're constantly force-feeding the player information about what they're doing, it removes any kind of surprises or sense of discovery that the player might achieve from finding these things out on their own. And the more you do that, the less the player is going to be invested in the story. And the less the player is invested in the story, the more they have to be invested in the gameplay. Don't worry, we'll get there eventually. The point is that being as obnoxiously obvious as possible which is what Bethesda does with their writing these days, is a surefire way of making the player not really give much of a crap about what's going on in your narrative. So while the UC Vanguard has a potentially interesting setup, it just ends up collapsing in on itself about halfway through the questline, and you end up not giving much of a crap about it by the end. And after you get through all of that, you get access to the Crimson Fleet questline. Now, there are a couple of ways of getting access to this. One of them is by getting enough of a bounty on your head that the UC ends up capturing you and basically forces you to become an undercover agent in the Crimson Fleet. And the other way is that you complete the UC Vanguard questline and then you get recommended for special assignment of going undercover with the Crimson Fleet. Regardless of how you start the quest, once you have planted yourself within the Crimson Fleet, you're ultimately going to be tracking down some massive treasure that was left behind by the founder of the Crimson Fleet, which could potentially turn the tide and give the fleet the resources they need to be able to defeat UC SecDef once and for all, or of course just return everything to UC SecDef and thus be able to wipe out the Crimson Fleet. And the idea here is that they were trying to do something kind of like what Splinter Cell Double Agent does, where you have to make sure not to stray too far to one side or another to be able to maintain your cover, while also not being seen as going rogue by the agency that employs you. The problem with this is that in a game like Splinter Cell Double Agent, that actually is more of a moral dilemma. In Bethesda's Starfield, on the other hand, there is only one choice that actually matters in the entire Crimson Fleet questline as far as where your loyalties lie. And it's at the very end of the questline. It basically just says, okay, you can either join the fleet now, or you can go back to the UC and side with them. It actually doesn't even matter what you do up to that point. Because if you go the full raging psychopath route like you think you would have to do to fully side with the fleet, well, the UC will complain about it, but as long as you make that choice to side with them at the end, they're fine with you. And on the other hand, you can go almost completely non-violent, and you would think that would be the UC route, but the fleet's fine with you for doing that. They just express a bit of surprise that you didn't handle it in the most direct, violent way possible and say, oh, that's a bit weird, but whatever, it's cool. And what's especially funny about this whole questline is that the entire time you are trying to get in the good graces of Delgado, the leader of the Crimson Fleet, and he's just an asshole the entire time. So when you get to the end of it, and let's say you side with the UC, all of a sudden people are acting like it must have been a really difficult decision to build up all that trust with Delgado and then betray him like that. No, Bethesda, it's not difficult to betray Delgado because he's an asshole the entire time you know him. It's not like he's your friend or anything. I mean, seriously, at absolute best, you're basically like the most useful of his cronies. He doesn't actually give much of a crap about you. I mean, hell, I have way more sympathy for the personnel that live and work at the Key, people like the mechanic that works on their ships, or the various shopkeeps that keep them supplied. Those characters actually do have some degree of sympathy, but all the writers cared about was your betrayal of Delgado, and he doesn't even register on your give-a-fuck-o-meter. If anything, because he's always an asshole to everybody, you're just happy to see him either put behind bars or outright dead. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder why you would even bother siding with the Crimson Fleet in the first place. I mean, the only tangible benefit you get for that are a living space on their main base, the Key, access to the Crimson Fleet mission boards where you can accept generic space pirate missions, and the fact that the space pirates won't attack you on sight anymore. Which in turn breaks any of the mission board quests that you go on that require you to attack space pirates because they're not hostile to you, so you can just kind of walk in, find the specific target that you need to take down, and take them down. Not to mention the fact that by completing the Crimson Fleet questline in favor of the fleet, that should pretty much put a permanent bounty on your head, and thus when you wander into settlements, there should be some consequences for that, but nope, they don't put a bounty on your head or anything. You just can wander into any settlement like it's nothing. It's like they just didn't think things through at all. And speaking of not thinking things through at all, there's the Ryujin Industries questline, which I found out after going into that about halfway through my playthrough is actually supposed to be your introduction to the stealth and security mechanics. Except you have to remember that this game is designed in such a way to where anybody can complete any of the quest lines at any time with any set of skills. which means that while the Ryujin Industries questline intends you to use stealth and security of course being lockpicking, you don't actually need to, and in fact for the vast majority of quests during this questline, you just go from the headquarters to some other location and either talk to an NPC, or maybe open a side door and fiddle with some computer terminal, or steal an item and then go back to headquarters and talk to the mission giver. And in fact, on the missions that are part of this questline that actually encourage you heavily to use stealth, namely the tower infiltration mission and the one where you have to infiltrate a rival corporation's headquarters and do some industrial sabotage, I discovered in my attempts to be stealthy during those missions that the stealth system in this game is completely broken. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that to get an indicator that you are in stealth at all, you have to put a point into the stealth skill rather than just having it by default. I mean that in order to get the ability to pickpocket at all, you have to put a point specifically into the theft skill, and that unless you absolutely max out your stealth skill and use stealth improving chems and stealth improving gear, the enemy will notice you no matter what, through multiple walls, behind them. And so I said, screw it, let's see if we can get through these missions without using stealth at all, and just running through the entire thing without attacking anyone. Turns out, that actually works perfectly fine, especially when you were at the point I was, where I was high enough level to where the enemies were doing almost no damage to me whatsoever, so I barely even had to use med packs. What was even more hilarious is that when I went through those missions and just ran through the entire area without attacking anyone, without even attempting stealth, it still counted as being stealthy, even though I triggered every alarm and guard in those places, just because I didn't shoot back. When I decided to say screw it and ran through the entire Ryujin Tower quest line for that, and I went back to the quest giver and he was like, wow, you went in and out without a trace. It was like there was nobody here, even though I triggered every alarm and guard in the place and they were constantly shooting at me the whole time. It was just so utterly absurd that I couldn't help but burst out laughing. It was one of the most ridiculous gaming experiences I've had in a long time. I mean, this stealth system is so bad that not only is it like Bethesda just said, screw it, let's just let them finish the quest line regardless, but it's so bad that I actually feel sorry for whoever's thankless task it was to try to build missions around the stealth system. I mean, obviously, they failed spectacularly in that regard, but is it really their fault? I'm inclined to say no, unless it's the same people who are responsible for breaking the stealth system in the first place. I mean, it's not like the stealth mechanics in Bethesda's previous games were any good to begin with, but they've really outdone themselves on the crapitude with this one. And even once you get past the whole Ryujin Industries is the tutorial for stealth and security thing, the questline itself is actually just not all that interesting. You're going on some very basic industrial espionage stuff, and then towards the end of it, they go, oh, by the way, there's a mole in the company, and we need to find out who that is. And then we need to deal with the situation. And then the questline's over. You become a trusted operative of the high-ranking executives, and then you get access to the Ryujin Industries mission board for generic missions, which is located in the office that they give you in Ryujin Industries Tower, which is just a very small room with a computer desk in it, and that's about it. And unfortunately, that covers all of the major quest lines in the game. I guess unless you count the companion quest lines, where at a certain point in building up your affinity level with a companion, you'll automatically begin their companion quest line where you have to solve some personal problem that they're dealing with, and then once you've done that, then it's back to normal. If you have been attempting to romance that particular companion by flirting with them the whole time, then you'll have the option of committing to a relationship with them and potentially joining together with them in a union, this game's equivalent of marriage. And while they are some of the better quest lines in the game, that's not really saying much. I mean, the main faction quest lines are bland and uninteresting for the most part, even though their setups might be cool. And the same kind of thing happens for the companion quest lines. You end up with situations where the idea of what you're doing in the quest line is rather solid and could be done in a really cool manner, but the actual substance of the quest line, what you're actually doing, what the characters are experiencing, and what they're saying, is about as engaging as a TPS report. Bethesda's writing and game design just isn't strong enough to support the companions themselves or their quest lines. And if you decide to stray from being a goody two-shoes, then the companions are constantly judging you for the things you're doing and getting mad at you for doing them. So you might just disengage from doing companion quests at all and taking companions with you, except for Vasco, because he's a robot and he doesn't judge what you do. He's just there to help you out. He helps you fight things, he helps you carry things, and that's about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not like the companions in, say, Fallout 4 were particularly good either, but at least they actually had some personality to them. It wasn't a whole lot, but they had way more variety in their personalities than anything you see in Starfield, where everybody just comes across as a bland NPC. And believe me when I tell you that when I can find something positive to say about Fallout 4 in comparison to another game, that is depressing. But you know what the saddest part is about all of this? It's not the quest lines, it's not the main storyline, it's not the companions, it's not even the NPCs. It's the setting itself. At no point did the settled systems ever feel like they could actually be real. If you stop and think about all the setting information that is presented to you, you have no idea how cities support themselves. There's no farmland anywhere near New Atlantis, for example. It's just the city itself. The city itself feels way tinier than it should, given that it's the largest city and the capital of the United Colonies. I mean, occasionally when you go onto a fairly large vessel, you'll find that there's a hydroponics area, so you know how they feed themselves, but you never see any kind of hydroponics in cities or any kind of farmland surrounding cities. You don't see any factories producing the goods that people are purchasing. So how do these settlements support themselves? Do the goods just pop up out of thin air? I mean, even the starport at New Atlantis is just 2 landing pads, when you would think it would be massive given that it's the capital of the UC, but no, it's not. I mean, sure, you can make an argument that for gameplay purposes, they're only showing you certain parts of the city to make sure that the performance is at least kind of playable, or that you're only experiencing things that are relevant to gameplay. But then you're in a situation where you don't feel like you're wandering around in a living, breathing world, and are instead wandering around a video game level. To make matters worse, it's hard to pin down things like the worth of credits. I mean, it's the only currency in the settled systems, so you would expect that it would be consistent and understandable, but it's not. One moment, the game will act like 1,000 credits is a lot of money, and yet you can spend 1,000 credits on a handful of very basic food items. Weapons and spacesuits often cost thousands upon thousands of credits. Spaceships will cost tens or potentially even hundreds of thousands of credits, and then residences always cost tens of thousands of credits as well, and yet you'll go into negotiation prompts and you'll be spending maybe a maximum of 4,000 or 5,000 credits, as if you're just slipping a guy a $100 bill or something. Quests that send you to high-level areas will reward you with maybe 5,000 to 10,000 credits, but you'll make potentially that much or even more just looting a random facility that you find somewhere in the low-level areas. It's the kind of thing that makes it pretty painfully obvious they didn't actually base the value of credits on anything tangible, and just said, screw it, we're just gonna assign random numbers to things, and that'll be fine because video game. And then of course there's things like the weapon designs, where you have 7.77 by 27mm caseless ammunition being the same ammunition for a pistol, a P90 style submachine gun, and an assault rifle, and yet they have wildly different damage values, and the assault rifle variant uses the same exact magazines that the P90 variant uses, but for some reason has 20 less rounds in it. You see, the part of me that understands video game development and balancing understands that they did this for gameplay mechanic reasons. The part of me that understands how firearms work, on the other hand, goes, Bethesda, what the hell are you doing? Not to mention things like, why the hell is the so-called Old Earth hunting rifle a VSS rifle, which are extremely rare today, let alone in the 2300s? Why is the Old Earth assault rifle an AKM without the stock attached, and you can't attach a stock to it no matter which attachments you put on the gun? And going off of the fact that the AKM has absolutely no recoil mitigation system built into it whatsoever, why is the recoil on it so low, and why does it go directly back into the shooter as opposed to kicking up wildly? Why is the Old Earth pistol obviously an M1911, only it's not actually an M1911, and why is the XM2311, that is clearly supposed to be a very modern, currently produced in the 2300s version of the gun, not using more modern iron sights than what we were using in the 1940s? I mean, hell, even an entry-level 1911 these days has better iron sights than that, and for some utterly baffling reason, they stuck with that for the 2311 super high-tech version that still has to have a mount put on it to be able to mount a reflex sight instead of just drilling it directly into the slide like we do these days. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know that game developers generally don't know very much about firearms, but this is pretty pathetic. This is the kind of stuff you could very easily solve with an extremely quick Google search. And then, of course, there's the weird stuff where it's a fully sci-fi gun and I have no idea how it works, like the Rattler. I have no idea how it's supposed to lift ammunition from the very, very forward magazine that is directly underneath the very tip of the barrel. It's the kind of thing that makes you look at it and go, this physically could not function, what is going on here? And even the guns that conceivably could function, even with stuff like caseless ammunition, you look at the designs and go, that looks horribly uncomfortable and non-ergonomic. When ergonomics are stuff we figured out well over a century ago at this point. And I know that this kind of stuff in isolation is really small details, but it all adds up. It's the kind of stuff that you look at and go, Bethesda didn't really think their universe through very well, did they? And the more you notice these kinds of things, the more it all adds up to feeling like you're just wandering around in a video game and not an actual place. And you have to understand that Bethesda is not necessarily known for making video game levels. They are known for making worlds that you just transport yourself to and explore. And you never get that feeling with Starfield at all. Whether it be in these smaller details that I've already brought up, or just the general design of the areas you're wandering around in, or even, to some degree, things as simple as the user interface and the controls and the mechanics, there is always something breaking your immersion, and eventually you just give up on even trying to be immersed in the first place. And if you can't get immersed in the world, and you can't really give much of a crap about the writing, that means the only thing that is left to hold the game up is its gameplay. So what are we dealing with there? Well, where do I even really begin with that? Because ordinarily in a game like this I might start with something like character creation, but even the game itself doesn't start with character creation. You start walking around and doing a bunch of mining. And only after you have encountered your first artifact does the game actually bring you to character creation. So I guess let's go ahead and start there. As far as mining goes, you get your cutter, which is a mining laser. You point it at a mineral deposit, and you press and hold the button until eventually the mineral deposit bursts and you get a unit of that particular mineral. Be prepared to do this an awful lot because you will be needing those resources for something that I'll be bringing up later. As far as basic movement goes, it's mostly the same as what we saw with previous Bethesda games built on this engine, so you can walk around, you can run around, although it's really more like a light jog. You can hold the sprint button down to sprint for a speed boost. You can jump, you can crouch. If you crouch, you go into stealth mode, and if you have a boost pack equipped, then you can press the jump button again while you're in the air after your first jump, and that will activate your boost pack to give you a boost along, sort of like a jetpack. If you sprint or jump, then you use up a portion of oxygen. Once this depletes, then you start gaining carbon dioxide. Once that completely fills up the meter, then you can no longer sprint until the CO2 meter has completely bottomed out and you've gone back to having oxygen positive. The especially fun part about this system is that if you're over encumbered and are moving around without doing the really slow walk, then you're also depleting the oxygen meter and eventually filling up the CO2 meter. Like with other games in Bethesda's repertoire, you also cannot fast travel while over-encumbered, which gets really irritating because you will be over-encumbered all the damn time. Again, for reasons I'll explain a bit later on. Now, the mining laser also introduces you to the basic shooting mechanics, which are, well, they're really basic. You have the aim button, which allows you to aim down the sights or scope of your weapon, and you have the shoot button. There are no secondary fires on anything. It's almost the exact same shooting mechanics that were in Fallout 4, but with some very slight tweaks. And there's no VATS system either, so you can't just lock onto an enemy and rely on that to be able to hit them if they're particularly difficult to see. Speaking of, you would think that in the far future, where you have energy weapons and space travel and such, that your helmet would be able to cycle between a couple of different vision modes, maybe putting in some sort of light intensifying mode, maybe even a heat vision mode. Nope, you get a flashlight, and that's it. If you want to be able to see the outline of an enemy, particularly in the dark, then you need to have a weapon equipped with a recon scope, and then you aim down your sights at that enemy for a few seconds until eventually they start showing up as a sort of heated outline. But even that is only temporary. The other option you have is to pull out your hand scanner, which will show you an outline of any interactable object as well as NPCs, but if you have your hand scanner out, then the only air quotes weapon that you can have out is the mining laser. So the simple act of trying to see where an enemy is in a particularly dark or cluttered environment can have you constantly going back and forth between your hand scanner and your actual weapon so you can fight, which gets really janky. And while I've got plenty more to say about the hand scanner, it's going to have to wait until after I finish my bit about the combat here, because aside from having a hard time seeing enemies, the only other thing you really get is a throwable item button, which will either be landmines or grenades. So while this is a feature that has been in a lot of games for a long time, this is the first time Bethesda has implemented it in one of their games and had it mapped to a dedicated button, as opposed to having to hold down the melee button until you get the throwing indicator sound, and then letting go of the melee button to throw the item. That was how Fallout 4 and 76 handled it, and while it certainly worked, it wasn't really intuitive. So hey, at least they addressed that, but the rest of the actual combat mechanics are almost identical to Fallout 4's. Down to the aforementioned weapon switch stuttering and lack of partial reloads, as well as the severe bullet sponge effect. This was something that really plagued Fallout 4 and 76, where the higher level you got, the more HP they gave enemies, so even if you were using your best weapons, every single enemy would just take a ludicrous amount of damage to go down. Same exact thing happens in Starfield. The difference is, Fallout 4 and 76 have fairly extensive gore systems, so when you blast enemies to bits in that, it can actually be kind of viscerally satisfying. You don't get that in Starfield. There's barely even blood in the game as far as the combat goes. So you end up sitting there putting hundreds upon hundreds of rounds into an enemy, and all they'll do once their HP bottoms out is slump over. Maybe if the last shot is on their boost pack, then the boost pack will explode, but that's still not very satisfying because the most that happens there is they get blasted into the air for a brief moment before just falling back to the ground. Even using the space magic, your powers, doesn't actually give you any kind of visceral, satisfying feeling, because you'll get something like the gravity wave power that you would think would be like unrelenting force from Skyrim, where it would send enemies flying, but nope, it just causes them to slowly slump over. Or you'll get solar flare, which you think would be some very powerful energy attack, but nope, it's just a really basic fireball that does a bit of damage. And what's even funnier is that absolutely nobody except for your companions reacts to you having space magic powers. Whenever you're using them in public areas or you're using them against enemies, nobody even acknowledges their existence. So I guess even Bethesda acknowledges that the powers are kind of pointless. And when you combine that lack of visceral feedback with the fact that the enemies are astoundingly stupid, it makes the combat extremely boring. I mean, on the ground combat side of things, the enemies simply cannot put up a fight. Those terror morphs I mentioned as part of the UC Vanguard questline that are made out to be these unstoppable juggernauts of death, they are defeated by standing on a box slightly higher off the ground than the enemy is standing. They have absolutely no idea how to deal with that. They'll just stand there and let you blast them to pieces. Humanoid enemies are at least marginally smarter than that because they'll at the very least take cover and try to shoot at you from cover, but that's as smart as they get, and it's nowhere near enough. You can just walk right up to them if they're hiding behind cover and they will just stand up and keep trying to shoot at you while you pistol whip them to death. The enemies in this game pose so little of a threat to you that you can wander into areas that are rated at 20, 30, 40 plus levels higher than you, and just mow down all the enemies there like it's absolutely nothing, just because the enemies are so ridiculously stupid, and the only thing that those levels do is increase the amount of health the enemies have and increase the amount of damage they do to you. And that's all increasing the difficulty does as well. It doesn't make the enemies smarter, it just makes them even more bullet spongy than they already are, so they drag out the battles even further and make them even more frustratingly boring. To make matters worse in this regard, even if the enemies do manage to inflict enough damage on you that it actually becomes a problem, the game doesn't actually let you know this until it's almost too late. The actual feedback you get from taking damage is almost invisible. The only time you get any more clear indication that you've taken a lot of damage is when your health bar hits the red portion and you get a sound notification and a bit of a blur on your screen and go, oh, maybe I need to pop a health pack now. Which you will be positively swimming in throughout the entire game, I might add, because the game basically hands out med packs like candy. And I should mention, by the way, that I put absolutely no points into the combat skills whatsoever for ground combat anyway. I certainly put them into Starship combat, because Starship combat is a completely different story, but we'll get there when we get there. But for ground combat, you don't need to put any of the points into those skills. I mean, sure, you might increase the amount of damage you do with a specific weapon type, but with the way the game's loot system works, you may not necessarily have a good weapon of that particular type with you at any given moment, so you just end up using whatever you can find that happens to be at an appropriate damage level for where you are, and just spend however much ammunition it takes to bring the enemies down. Not that that matters all that much either, because the game pretty much throws ammunition at you like candy, and you also will have so many credits that you will not know what to do with them, so you can just buy out all of the ammunition from all of the shops in the game and never worry about running out of ammo. Which is particularly impressive when you start wasting upwards of 500 or 600 rounds on a single enemy just because of how much of a bullet sponge they are. But what's especially funny is when you start getting weapons and other gear that is rewarded to you as part of quest lines, and it is dramatically weaker than the stuff you found 20 levels ago in some random facility on some random rock in space. There are almost none of these supposedly unique items that are actually worth using in comparison to the randomly generated loot weapons, and even then those unique weapons aren't really unique in anything apart from appearance, and even that is only on certain weapons. Most of the quest reward weapons don't actually have unique appearances, they just have a unique name, and they function exactly like any randomly generated version of that particular weapon, but with a specific set of stats. It makes the act of trying to find a fun piece of gear to use utterly pointless, because all you're going to care about is the raw numbers of damage that you're doing to enemies, because the combat is just not remotely enjoyable, so you want to get through it as quickly as you possibly can, by doing the highest damage that you possibly can, at the highest rate of fire that you possibly can. And if you're trying to get through the combat as quickly as possible because it is so obnoxiously boring that it makes you want to do pretty much anything else, you have failed catastrophically as a first-person shooter, or in this particular case, as a first-person shooter mixed with RPG elements. So if the ground combat, which is a huge portion of this game, is such a catastrophic failure, what about the rest of the gameplay mechanics? Well, let's start with the character creation system, which is what was introduced to you technically after all of the stuff I've already talked about here. During character creation, you have a rather robust appearance generator, much like you did with Fallout 4 and 76, and while you don't have attributes like the special system in Fallout 4 and 76, you do have a selection of skills that you can choose from, and you have various background traits that ostensibly give you more role-playing opportunities. Things like growing up within a certain faith, or growing up as a UC native or a Freestar native. The idea there being that you're going to have additional insight into things as you progress through the game, and you'll get some unique opportunities. In reality, you get a very small number of extra dialogue options based on your choices that don't really help you out much in the long run. They might be a slightly different way of wording something that you have regardless of what your background is. Or it might simply be commenting on some historical event that you would happen to know. The only really tangible benefits you get from some of these traits are one of them gives you an extra companion in the form of the Adoring Fan, if you're, I don't know, a masochist or something and you want to be miserable throughout the game, as well as one that has your parents still being alive and well in New Atlantis, so that gives you their apartment to visit and you can find them at certain points as you wander around the galaxy, and that's kind of it, apart from also sending them 500 credits every in-game week, which is basically nothing, so you never really need to worry about that. And then there are also a couple of them that are mutually exclusive that say that you grew up within a certain faith, and so if you go to the church of that faith in New Atlantis, then there is a chest there with some extra gear for you, but it blocks you off from getting the chest in the other faith. Absolutely none of these traits have a major impact on the game, however, so you're just gonna pick whatever you think fits your specific flavor for the avatar that you're creating, and you're gonna be much more concerned with the background that you pick, which gives you a selection of 3 skills that you get an automatic point in. Now, of course, from there, once you start leveling up, you'll get a single skill point per level that you can put into any skill, regardless of whether you're already trained in it or not. And you find out very quickly that the skill system is one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire game. I've already mentioned this to some degree talking about the stealth system, but the way the skill system is set up in this game is that you either get a passive bonus to whatever it may well be, whether it's a weapon skill giving you a passive bonus to damage with a particular weapon type, or a skill giving you a passive bonus to affinity generation with a companion, or a passive increase to your ship's shielding, or the amount of damage that your ship does with the different weapon types, and so on and so forth. Or, and the much more frustrating aspect of this, it blocks off content until you've reached arbitrary milestones. You see, if you want to be able to put various weapon attachments on your weapons, you need to level up the appropriate skill for that. But you can't simply put the point into that skill and just keep putting points into it. Oh, no, 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 no. Once you've put a point into a skill, regardless of what that skill is, then you have to complete a challenge in order to unlock the next stage of that skill that you can put a point into. So for example, with the weapon attachments one, you put a point into the skill, you unlock the ability to research the various weapon attachments that are unlocked at that stage, and then once you have finished the research for them, then you can make the weapon attachments for that stage. If you want the next stage of the skill and get access to more weapon attachments, then you need to craft an arbitrary number of weapon attachments in order to complete the challenge for that rank and unlock the next rank, so that when you get your next skill point available, you can put a skill point into that and get the next level of the skill. And then at that point, you have to do the research again for the new stuff, and you have to craft more weapon attachments, an arbitrary number that is higher than the previous stage, of course, in order to unlock the next stage of the skill. You will repeat this process until you get to the end of that particular skill track and you max out the level at level 4. Now, for some of these skill rank challenges, they're fairly simple and straightforward. Things like crafting an arbitrary number of weapon attachments, or suit upgrades, or things like that. The kind of stuff that you would probably be doing normally as you go and get new gear and decide to upgrade it. Some of it, like upgrading the weapon skills, requires you to get kills with those particular weapons. Again, very simple and straightforward. But then there are the ones that are a real pain in the ass to get. Like the increases for persuasion, for example, where you have to succeed at persuasion attempts. Sounds really easy, until you realize that the persuasion system in Starfield is absolutely terrible. You are given a limited number of attempts. You have to reach a certain arbitrary number of points in order to succeed at the persuasion attempt. Sounds straightforward enough until you realize that the degree of RNG involved is incredibly frustrating. Regardless of whether you're picking one that is supposedly easy and has a low point value, or one that is ridiculously difficult and has a very high point value, it is a random chance to succeed. And it does not matter whether you select options that you would think would make sense for a conversation with the particular character that you're talking to, or whether you're picking things that make absolutely no sense and do not chain together at all in the conversation. They have the same arbitrary success or failure rate. It's all determined by the level of your persuasion skill, as well as the bonuses that you get from any equipment that you're wearing, or any chems that you're using that will enhance the chance that you will succeed. Even then, it's still a random chance, so you can stock up on all that stuff and still fail persuasion attempts. It gets incredibly frustrating. To make matters worse, you have to spend a skill point each to unlock the ability to intimidate and the ability to bribe, or in this case, negotiate, as they call it. Those aren't just part of the persuasion system like you would think they would be. You have to unlock them first. It is baffling. And even if you have those unlocked, they are still an RNG chance to succeed or fail. They just occasionally give you a few extra options during your persuasion attempt. And what's even funnier is when the negotiation ability in particular fails, because you can have the negotiation ability say, oh, you need to spend 4,000 credits or something like that for this persuasion attempt, and then it fails, and then you completely fail the persuasion attempt, and then you get an option after that that's only 500 credits that will always succeed because it's not a persuasion attempt. For the life of me, I have no idea what they were thinking with this persuasion system, but it is atrocious. And the fact that in order to have any chance of reliably succeeding at it requires you to level up the persuasion skill, which in turn requires you to succeed at persuading a lot of times, multiplies that frustration by several orders of magnitude. And the same kind of thing happens for other skills as well. Do you want to be stealthy? Well, you have to put a point into the stealth skill to get an indicator saying you're in stealth or not. You have to put a point into the theft skill to be able to pickpocket. These are all incredibly basic mechanics that in previous Bethesda games you could just do. You might not be good at them, but you could just do them. And in Starfield, they put them behind a grind wall. And even aside from locking basic mechanics behind the grind wall of skills, there's also the grind wall of things like being able to get better ships by having to upgrade the piloting skill to unlock B and C class ships, the challenge for which requires you to get ship kills, which sounds fine until you realize that your starting ship is really weak, and you can just get torn apart by enemy ships incredibly easily. It's pretty much the exact opposite problem of the ground combat, where ground combat is obnoxiously easy and insanely boring. Ship combat is incredibly frustrating and bullshit difficult. Enemy ships can just hit you for absurd amounts of damage incredibly quickly, and they lock onto you immediately when you show up in the star system, so you have barely any chance to react to them. The actual ship flight controls are really clunky on keyboard and mouse, so you're probably gonna have to switch over to a gamepad, as you see me doing throughout most of the ship footage in this video. And even that isn't enough to make the mechanics not feel horribly clunky, and even then it's a matter of you drop the enemy's shields with lasers usually, but also missiles, and then you do hull damage with ballistic weapons or missiles until eventually the ship breaks apart. If you want to specifically target an enemy system, so maybe knock out their engines so you can then board them, then that's another skill unlock you have to use in order to get the ability to target systems. Again, more basic mechanics locked behind a grind wall. But anyway, starting this out, even attacking one ship is often a bit of a death sentence, but as soon as you start running into 2 or 3 enemy ships at once, you're pretty much screwed until you can get a better ship, which you can't do until you've leveled up your piloting skill, which you can't do reliably until you've gotten a better ship, which you can't get unless you have completed the Freestar Collective quest line, which by that point you've probably leveled up your piloting skill enough to get a better ship anyway, or you've simply earned enough credits, whether it be through selling crap or completing side missions or whatever, until you can get to the point where you can afford a new ship that somehow is within whatever piloting range you still have, and be able to upgrade it with components so that you can actually survive a fight. But regardless of which situation you're going with, it's still a grind, and it is still immensely frustrating. And even then, at the end of the day, the ship combat itself is incredibly basic, almost more basic than the ground combat is, because you just lock onto an enemy ship, and you just shoot at it until eventually its shields go down, and then eventually its hull bottoms out. If an enemy locks onto your ship, then you can press the boost button to break the lock on the ship, and enemies will do the same kind of thing to you, by the way, so you need to reacquire your lock, and it just ends up being this incredibly dull, repetitive loop. Frankly, the only thing that's actually kind of neat about the space combat system is that you can disable an enemy's engines, and then you can board them by docking with the enemy ship, and then you can hop onto the enemy ship and clear out all of them there, and take that ship for your own fleet. Thing is, when you say fleet, it's not actually a fleet. You can't have crew manning the other ships. It's only one ship that you're allowed to actually fly around at any given point. It's your active ship, your home ship, and everything else just sits in the fleet and waits for you to pick it as your home ship or to sell it. And that's it, really. There's no actual fleet mechanics, which is really baffling. You don't know why you would call it a fleet if it's not actually a fleet. It's just basically a garage. Hell, being able to actually have a fleet of ships with their own crews following you around and doing stuff with you would actually make the game a hell of a lot more engaging, but nope, they just can't be bothered to put something like that in, apparently. Or the engine's not capable of it. It's hard to tell. Either way, the skill system doesn't feel like you're actually getting any freedom of choice with developing your character. It feels more like you're just overcoming arbitrary obstacles to being able to do stuff that you want to do. Whether it be unlocking basic gameplay mechanics, or unlocking attachments for your weapons, or upgrades for your suit, or being able to cook food, or make drinks, or make chems or medicine for you to use, or unlock various things that you can build at your outposts. Whatever the case may be, it feels like the skill system is just a roadblock that reduces almost the entire game down to an incredibly tedious grind. Oh, and as if that weren't enough of a grind, There's also the fact that for most of these various attachments, recipes, that sort of thing, you have to complete research projects on top of the skill unlocks to be able to craft the various things, and those research projects require a large amount of materials, starting with really basic stuff, moving on up into much more difficult to find materials. This might mean that you want to go around the galaxy and mine out those materials yourself, or build outposts to get resource production up or something like that. But here's the funny thing about that. Because you're going to be constantly swimming in credits from completing missions and just looting crap and selling things, you will never actually need to worry about those resources. You can just buy them. Which, funnily enough, completely removes the point of the outpost system, because that's really all outposts are for, is to generate resources for you. Even the really basic settlement mechanics in Fallout 4 were actually more interesting than this, because you would build up the settlement, you would build up its defenses, and you could improve the happiness of your settlers in that particular settlement. There's none of that in the outpost system in Starfield. You just build the outpost, you assign a couple of crew members to it, you never need to worry about their food, their water, their oxygen, anything like that. You never need to worry about their happiness. All that they're there for is to generate resources for you. And while the building system itself is definitely a hell of a lot better than what we saw in Fallout 4, that's not saying much. The building system in Fallout 4 was garbage. It barely functioned most of the time. At least the outpost building system in Starfield mostly functions. It's just really weird to control with keyboard and mouse, so like with the starship building and the starship controls themselves, you're probably going to want to switch over to a gamepad for them. That said, even the outpost building mechanics are not immune to really weird issues, like the turret targeting problem that I experienced, where I made a separate video showing this, but I put down a turret in one of my outposts to defend it from the constant animal attacks it was having, and while it certainly would attack the animals, it would also attack the crew members that were assigned to the outpost. And I have no idea why. I'm sure it's something they'll fix eventually, but who knows how long it'll take them to patch that out, and more importantly, it's just indicative that they just didn't really give much of a crap about the outpost system, even though they were actually touting it when they were hyping the game up. They were also really hyping up their ship building system, and I've already mentioned that the interface for it is really clumsy and awkward to use with a keyboard and mouse, so you really need to use a gamepad with it. Even then, it's still pretty clumsy and awkward. But the actual shipbuilding mechanic itself is also really janky. I mean, as you're building out your ship, you can only have it within certain length and width parameters, and if you manage to go over those, then it won't let you finish building it without, of course, modding the game. And even as you continue to build out your ship and attach various components to it, it's automatically creating doorways between sections, and not necessarily in ways that you want it to. You want to be able to specify where the doorways go so the ship has an intuitive layout, but it just arbitrarily picks one of the doorways to go with, so if you want to actually build the ship out the way you want it to be laid out, you have to specifically go out of your way to make sure that all of the various ship components line up with each other in exactly one way so that there's only one doorway between those particular ship components. It is a really janky system that generally results in ship layouts that are a pain in the ass to navigate when you step out of the cockpit and just start trying to find some either crew member or something on your ship that you want to interact with. Oh, and in case you were wondering if the ship components managed to escape the grind wall that you have with so many other things, of course they didn't. There is a skill specifically for starship design that the various ship components are blocked behind. Oh, by the way, you also need to level up your piloting skill to be able to use all of these things, because if you get a C-grade ship component and try to put it onto an A-grade ship, it's not going to work. So even the shipbuilding mechanic that Bethesda was supposedly really proud of, and which you look at and think, wow, this actually could be really cool, turns out to be an immensely frustrating chore. I mean, sure, if you mod out the limiters that prevent you from building out the ship exactly how you want it to, then you can get something out of it, but then you're still having to work around the weird janky mechanics of the shipbuilding itself, and you probably won't end up with a ship that actually performs well, because the ships also have stats that depend on what engines you've got, what drive core you've got, what the reactor you've got is, what your various weapons are, and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, of course, the bigger and heavier your ship, the slower it's going to move and turn, which can be kind of frustrating, of course. And your grav drive is going to determine how far of a system you can jump to. So if you want to get out to the furthest reaches of space and get to those level 75 areas that are end-game areas effectively, then you need a really beefy grav drive, which means you're going to need to level up your starship design and your piloting. But even if you manage to do all of that, the one thing that really kills this game more than any other mechanic is the fact that it is a game that is ostensibly about space exploration and discovery, that has absolutely no space exploration and discovery in it. You think to yourself, I want to go out into the furthest reaches of space and just see what's there, see what weird things I can encounter, what strange experiences I can have. But no matter where you go, whether it's in the core systems that are supposed to be heavily developed, or out into the furthest reaches of space where there's supposed to be basically nothing there, there is nothing to discover. There is nothing to explore, because it's all already been explored. It doesn't matter which planet you go to. There are always man-made facilities there. Whether it's in the core systems, or in the more middle systems, or out in the very furthest reaches of space, it does not matter. You're never the first person on that planet. In fact, there are plenty of other facilities built on that planet before you, because every single planet in this game is an instanced, somewhat randomly generated area that picks from a selection of pre-made facilities and just spawns them at different points on the world. This means that you will be encountering the same listening posts, the same research towers, the same cryo labs, the same mine facilities, the same ecliptic bases, the same factories over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And they will always have the exact same enemies in them every single time. The loot you find will be in the exact same places every single time, including loot that is supposed to be unique, like the various magazines that are supposed to give you a passive bonus, only you'll find dozens of them, because you'll just clear out the same facilities over and over again. Some of them you'll even clear out as part of the main storyline, but they'll have an extra bit tacked on at the end where you'll find an artifact. But otherwise, it is the same exact facility you've encountered potentially dozens of times as you've been wandering around these various planets. To make matters worse, when you land on a planet, you don't have a rover or anything like that. You just have to run every single place you want to go, which takes forever because pretty much all of the points of interest are several hundred meters minimum away from your ship, including things that are more story-based, like the various temples that give you the magic space powers. While the outward appearance of all of these temples might be a bit different, once you get inside the temple, it is the exact same float around the area and go through the sparkles puzzles every single time. When you go on any of the generic missions from the mission boards, you're just going to go to a random place, to a random facility that is picked from one of the generic lists, and you're just going to clear it out and find a specific enemy that is marked as the target, and even that enemy is generic. And you're going to take that enemy down, you're going to get the quest reward, and then you just move on. And if you want to be something of an explorer, you can wander around a planet and find where the mineral deposits and such are and scan them with your hand scanner. Or you might have to find the flora and fauna and just repeatedly scan them until eventually you've scanned an arbitrary number of the things so it counts as 100% scanned, and then you can move on to the next thing. And that's assuming you can even navigate the environment at all, because whether you're in one of the cities or on a ship or on a planet, you don't have a local map. The only map you get is the star map, which gives you the planets themselves in the star system. If you go to the local map, it is perhaps the single most useless map of this particular game type I have ever seen. It gives you absolutely no indication of where any of the stores are or where anything is other than the most basic fast travel point landmarks that you can imagine. There is basically no indication of what is between you and the point you are trying to get to, so you have to constantly rely on the hand scanner to even have a pathway to what you're trying to get to. And even if you complete a planetary survey, it really doesn't do anything for you. All it might do is complete one of the Constellation mission board missions, and you'll also get some survey data that you can then sell to Vlad or some of the other merchants for a bit of extra money. There are no sapient aliens in the galaxy, only non-sapient ones, basically animals and nothing more. And as you continue to explore the galaxy and find these various creatures, you'll notice that they just reuse the same creatures over and over and over again, but rename them slightly depending on which planet you're on. There are no ancient mysteries to uncover. There is nothing in this game to actually discover. And before you've realized this, as you're wandering around the various planets and clearing out facilities and such, you're going to be constantly overburdened by all of the loot that you're carrying, as well as all of the resources you're carrying for all of your research projects, until eventually you have leveled up the perk that increases your carrying capacity enough, and you've also gotten enough cargo space on your ship so you can just store all of your junk. So even the mere act of trying to explore is a frustrating, tedious grind. And the entire game is billed as a game of space exploration and discovery. The reality of Starfield is that it's a game about an extremely repetitive gameplay loop. It's not about discovery, it's not about its storyline, it's not about the quests, it's not about the factions. It is about that extremely repetitive, extremely frustrating grind to eventually get into New Game Plus, and then continue grinding until you get to the next stage of New Game Plus, and just continue the process until you just get so tired of the game that you uninstall it and then never look at it again. It is a game that treats the player like an idiot who cannot figure anything out for themselves, so they have to be constantly told things in terms of storyline and even just where to look for anything. It is a game where the simple act of trying to navigate an area, one of the most simple things you can do in any game where you have direct control over a character or an avatar, is a frustrating chore. It is a game where even the basic interface is a massive pain in the ass to use. Even simple things like buying and selling things at a store require you to switch between multiple menus just to do that. Meanwhile, in previous Bethesda games, they had all of that on one screen and it was fine. Why they've set it up this way, I have absolutely no idea, but this kind of thing gets incredibly frustrating. You are constantly having to go through menu after menu just to get to what you want to get to, and to make matters worse, because of the way the creation engine has to be built with a bunch of instanced areas rather than one continuous area that constantly loads in new assets as you travel between them, you are constantly being assailed with loading screens, whether it be landing on a planet, docking with a starport or another ship, whether it be going from walking around the city into a building, whatever the case may be, you're going to go through at least 2 or 3 loading screens by the time you get to where you're trying to go, sometimes even more than that. Because of the way the creation engine has to build these instance areas, nothing in this game is seamless. You can't just hop into your ship, take off from wherever you've landed, go fly into some other place on the planet, land there, and then continue your exploration. You have to go to your ship, go through a loading screen as you get into the ship and either go directly to the cockpit or get into the ship and then walk to the cockpit. Then once you're in the cockpit, you have to go through another loading screen, which is masked by the takeoff animation, and then you go to the star map and you have to select another place on that planet to land the ship, and then you go through another loading screen, which is again masked as the ship lands through the animation, and then you have 2 options for exiting the ship. One of them is just to go and fully exit the ship immediately, and the other one is to get out of the cockpit and then walk your way to the ship's exit, which again requires a loading screen regardless, and then you can just wander around wherever you've landed on the planet. And if you want to go to somewhere else on the planet, you have to repeat this process. I would like to remind you that there was this indie game a few years ago that you may have heard of that had fully seamless hop into your ship, fly somewhere else on the planet, land, and then hop out and explore. And it was called No Man's Sky. And while that game was awful, at least the experience of hopping in your ship and flying around the galaxy and exploring was pretty much seamless. Meanwhile, Bethesda can't even do that because the creation engine is actively holding them back and preventing them from doing that because they haven't been going back through the code base and updating everything so that it can be done. And between that getting incredibly tiresome, and the interface being a pain to work with, the combat being as obnoxious as it is, the ship mechanics being as obnoxious as they are, the writing being as bad as it is, even things as simple as the level designations of areas being completely off, where you might enter a level 75 area and encounter enemies from level 1 all the way up to level 100 with absolutely no consistency whatsoever. Everything all blends together to make Starfield a catastrophic failure of a role-playing game. If you only count it as a first-person shooter with RPG elements, it still catastrophically fails. And while it's certainly not the worst game Bethesda's ever made, let's be honest, they've made some real stinkers over the years. I mean, hell, think about Fallout 76 being almost completely unplayable on launch, and even years down the line, it's still barely playable. Not to mention just depressingly terrible in general. Or, of course, The Elder Scrolls Blades, which I know is kind of cheating a bit because it's meant as a mobile game, but they released that on Switch, and they intended to put it on PC at some point, but they just never did, and that game's just an irredeemable disaster. Here, basically the only hope for Starfield is that modders just mod the living crap out of it, and even then, the base experience of Starfield is just so incredibly faulty that even modders probably won't be able to save this thing. And they won't even be able to attempt to do that until at the very least next year when Bethesda releases the modding tools that will allow them to actually put new content in the game and really delve into the files and such. And if I'm saying that modders are the game's only hope, then it has truly catastrophically failed. Because my policy is if the game is unable to stand on its own without mods, then it's not a good game and is thus not worth bothering with in the first place. And if you're one of those people who excuses the game's myriad problems because, well, modders will fix it eventually, then you're part of the problem. Bethesda has been allowed to make crappier and crappier games for far too long at this point. The modding community has been like a release valve, because whenever Bethesda screws something up, people will just say, oh, well, mods will fix it eventually. And then they'll just act like it's fine. No, it's not fine. Bethesda needs to step up. They need to actually do proper game development and fix their shit rather than relying on the community to fix their shit for them. I mean, hell, as I'm recording this video, the game still doesn't even have an FOV slider in it. One of the most basic features in a modern first-person title, or really a first-person title in general, and they don't have it. You have to go messing around in the game's config files to actually get the FOV to change. Because as it turns out, they also seem to have removed the console command for it, which makes absolutely no sense to me at all, and I have no idea why they couldn't just put an FOV slider in with the quick update that they put out fairly recently. It seems like that would be something really easy for them to do, but they can't even really seem to be bothered to do that, even though they said they would. They haven't put DLSS into the game, so somebody had to mod it in. And not only did that modder lock that behind a paywall with regards to their Patreon, they put DRM into their mod, which is just baffling. Obviously, there are now alternative mods out there that are free, but they shouldn't have to mod in something as basic as DLSS support. But they have to, because Bethesda didn't put DLSS support in the game at launch, because they had that AMD exclusivity deal and thus only had FSR, which is terrible. But at the end of the day, there's just so much wrong with the game that even if you are relying on the modding community to air quotes fix everything, they would have to basically rewrite the entire game, from the story to the actual game design. And there's just no way in hell they're going to be doing that. And as if all of that weren't enough, whatever DLC Bethesda throws around for the game isn't going to fix it either. It needs a proper ground-up rework. And I see absolutely no situation whatsoever where Bethesda does that. They are quite clearly happy with this absolute dumpster fire of a game. And while it's certainly sad to see, given that Bethesda's games have just been getting worse and worse and worse over time, I can't really say I'm surprised either. At the end of the day, though, Starfield is just an absolutely terrible game that I cannot recommend to anyone. Whether you're a diehard fan of Bethesda games or not, frankly, if you're a diehard fan of Bethesda games, you've probably already got several of their games that are far better than this, and you've been playing the crap out of them anyway, so just stick with those. And if you were considering giving the game a try on Game Pass, understand that the Game Pass version doesn't let you mod it. So there's not really much of a point in even bothering with that version of the game, because all you get is the base experience, and the base experience of Starfield is a 1 out of 5. Just don't bother with Starfield at all. It's not worth it. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me as it's been taking me quite a long while to get this video done. Special thanks to everybody who's contributing to the channel's Patreon. It's thanks to your support that I was actually able to get a copy of this game to review when I did. Otherwise I might have had to wait for a while, so thank you all very much for your support, and for those of you who are interested in helping out with the channel, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and links in the description if you're interested. And every bit certainly helps the channel out quite a lot. As for what's next, well, I certainly need a break after Starfield, so I'm going to go through a Medieval the Black Labyrinth and Ion Fury Aftershock, because I've been looking forward to those for quite a long time, and while they are expansion packs to games I've already reviewed, well, there's simply a very strong chance that I'm going to enjoy them, and I just need that at this point. From there, well, who knows? There's all kinds of stuff that I've been working on and off for the whole year, so keep an eye out for some long-term projects, one of which is definitely going to be Cyberpunk 2077, along with its Phantom Liberty expansion. Keep an eye out for that, hopefully by the end of the year. If not by the end of the year, it's going to be early next year, so we'll see how that one ends up going. And of course, I got a couple of surprises to throw in here and there as well, so keep an eye out for that stuff. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.